His grease-stained fingers trembled as he held the two objects in his hands. In one, her life, a cold, clinical insulin pen. In the other, her fortune, a velvet pouch heavy with the silent weight of diamonds. She was dying on the floor of her own fortress, the billionaire, who had everything now, had nothing. And he, the boy who had nothing now, held it all. He could take the fortune and let her fade away, a silent revenge for a life of being invisible. But as he looked down, it wasn't the diamonds that caught his eye. It was the small golden locket that had fallen open on her chest, revealing the faded photograph of a smiling boy. What he chose to do next would change both of their lives forever. If this story has already touched your heart, please give us a thumbs up and subscribe for more emotional and unexpected tales. Isabella Sterling stood in the center of the heart, and for a woman who commanded a global empire from the 68th floor of a skyscraper that pierced the Chicago skyline, this was the only place she felt truly in control. The heart wasn't merely a room, it was a monument to her will, a subterranean vault forged from brushed titanium and reinforced concrete buried deep beneath the foundations of Sterling Industries. It was her panic room, though she loathed the term. Panic was a messy, inefficient emotion she had surgically removed from her own psyche decades ago, replacing it with calculated risk and a relentless, unyielding ambition. To her, the heart was simply the final innermost layer of a life built on impenetrable defenses, the air recycled and filtered to a purity that would be the envy of any operating theater, hummed with the quiet, confident thrum of self-sufficiency. There were no windows to offer the illusion of an outside world. The only light was a cool, clinical glow that emanated from recessed strips in the ceiling, bathing the metallic walls in an unfeeling, shadowless white. It was a light that revealed no flaws and offered no warmth, much like Isabella herself. At 48, she was a striking figure, a statue carved from obsidian and success. Her tailored suit, a sharp navy that cost more than most people's cars, fit her, as if it were a second skin, a suit of armor for the corporate battlefield. Her hair was pulled back in a severe, elegant chignon that accentuated the sharp, proud lines of her jaw and her intelligent, unwavering eyes. Today was the biannual systems diagnostic, a ritual she insisted on overseeing personally. Trust in her world was a liability to be minimized. Verification was the only true strength. Her gaze, sharp and assessing, swept across the room, missing nothing. The hermetically sealed pallets of nutrient paste and purified water, enough to sustain 2 people for 6 months. The advanced medical bay, gleaming with stainless steel, complete with a diagnostic cot and an automated pharmacy, capable of synthesizing nearly any necessary compound. The humming server, racks their blue and green lights blinking in a silent, rhythmic dance, held mirrored copies of her entire corporate and personal data infrastructure. Every detail was a testament to her foresight, another brick in the fortress she had so meticulously constructed around her life. A fortress, she thought, with a familiar, bitter pang that tightened her chest, that had proven all too effective. The thought of her son Daniel was an unwelcome phantom, a ghost that even the titanium walls of the heart couldn't keep out. It had been 2 years since their last explosive argument, a confrontation that had severed the final frayed thread of their relationship. He had stood in the vast, echoing marble foyer of her penthouse, his face flushed with the kind of passionate, messy emotion she no longer recognized, and delivered the words that had become the silent, looping soundtrack to her life. "This isn't a home." "Mom," he'd said, his voice cracking with a pain she hadn't known how to address. "It's a fortress. You built it to keep the world out, but all you did was lock me out and yourself in. He had left the next day. There was no note, just an emptied room and a silence that roared louder than any boardroom shouting match. She hadn't seen him since. She had told herself it was a phase, a young man's naive rebellion against the very system that provided for him. But deep down, in a quiet, shuttered place she never allowed the light to touch, she knew he was right. A quiet electronic beep from the main console pulled her from the chilling memory. System diagnostics. Phase 1, complete. A disembodied synthesized voice announced into the stillness. Right on schedule. She glanced at the only other person in the room. He was the antithesis of everything she was, everything she had built. Young, probably in his early 20s, with a lean, wiry frame and pale skin that looked like it rarely saw the sun. His uniform, the drab grey overalls of a third-party maintenance contractor, was smudged with grease and hung loosely on his shoulders. His hair was a shaggy, indeterminate brown, and his eyes, when he bothered to look up from his work, were a startlingly clear blue, clouded with a weary cynicism that seemed far too old for his face. His name tag, clipped crookedly to his breast pocket, read simply, Leo. He was currently kneeling before an open service panel, his focus entirely on the intricate, colourful tangle of fibre-optic cables within. He moved with a practiced economy, his hands deft and sure, a surgeon operating on the fortress's nervous system. He hadn't spoken a word to her in the last hour, a fact for which she was grateful. Small talk was inefficient, a waste of valuable oxygen. Report, she commanded, her voice echoing slightly in the sterile space, sharp and accustomed to immediate obedience. Leo didn't look up. Thermocouplers are stable. O2 scrubbers are running at 99.7% efficiency. Core programming is clean. His voice was a low monotone, devoid of deference. He clipped a final wire into place with a soft click, and the panel hissed shut. I'm starting the security protocol simulations now. This is the part where it gets loud. Isabella folded her arms across her chest, unimpressed. Just get it done. He finally looked at her. Then a flicker of something annoyance, perhaps a spark of defiance, in his clear blue eyes. Yes, ma'am, he said, and the title, the way he said it, dripped with a subtle, grating irony that pricked at her formidable composure. He turned to the main console, his fingers flying across the holographic interface. A series of complex schematics bloomed in the air before him. He initiated the sequence. A low klaxon began to sound a steady, rhythmic pulse. It was supposed to be a simulation, a test of the lockdown sequence. Isabella had heard it a dozen times before. But this time something was different. The familiar amber test lights failed to appear. The klaxon was joined by a high-pitched, insistent whine, a sound she had never heard before, a sound that spoke of genuine alarm. Red lights, not amber, began to flash, painting the titanium walls in terrifying, pulsing strokes of crimson. "What is that?" She snapped her voice, sharp, cutting through the rising noise with a sudden cold dread. Leo's nonchalant demeanor vanished in an instant. His eyes widened as he stared at the console, at a string of angry red code scrolling rapidly in a language he clearly didn't expect. "That's not me," he said, his voice tight with a tension that mirrored her own. "That's a real alert. An external breach, level 1. Before the words had fully registered, the room responded with chilling efficiency. A deafening series of clicks echoed around them as magnetic locks, each capable of holding several tons of pressure, engaged. With a deep, groaning hiss of hydraulics that vibrated up through the soles of her expensive shoes, the main entrance, a 4-ton slab of solid titanium, began to slide shut. "No," Isabella shouted, a genuine primal fear, an emotion she had long since buried, clawing its way up her throat. She took an instinctive step toward the closing gap, as if her will alone could stop its inexorable movement. The gap narrowed, compressing the world outside into a thin, bright line, then vanishing completely. A final earth-shaking thump sealed their fate, the sound of finality. The klaxon stopped. The red lights died, replaced once again by the cold, sterile, indifferent white. A synthesized voice, calm and final, spoke from the ceiling, its perfect enunciation a mockery of their situation. Lockdown protocol engaged. External threat detected. The heart is now sealed. Deactivation in 12 hours. Silence. Absolute and profound. Isabella Sterling, a woman who controlled markets and bent boards of directors to her will, was a prisoner in her own gilded cage, and her only companion was the boy who looked at her as if she were the very thing he was meant to be protected from. For the first few minutes, the silence in the heart was a physical presence. It pressed in on them from all sides, amplifying the low, almost subliminal hum of the air scrubbers and the frantic, unfamiliar pounding of Isabella's own heart. The illusion of control, the central pillar of her existence, had been obliterated in less than 10 seconds. Her first instinct, honed by decades of corporate warfare, was to reassert it. "There is a manual override," she stated, her voice a low, dangerous command that had silenced boardrooms and sent stock prices plummeting. It was not a question. In her world, there was always an override, a back door, a fail-safe for people like her. "The chief of security, Mike, has the Alpha Prime code. Get him on the comms." Leo had risen to his feet and was staring at the main console, his earlier cynicism completely eclipsed by a tense, focused energy. He ran a hand through his shaggy hair, his brow furrowed in concentration. "The primary comms are dead," he said, his voice flat matter-of-fact. "That's part of the Level 1 protocol. It cuts all external data links to prevent remote hacking. It's a complete electronic quarantine. All links." Isabella challenged, stepping closer, unwilling to accept the simple, terrifying truth. "There's a hard line. A dedicated shielded fiber optic cable connected directly to the security command center. It's buried in 3 feet of concrete. It's supposed to be impenetrable." "Yeah, well, apparently not," Leo retorted, gesturing impatiently at a diagnostic screen that glowed with angry red warnings. "The system is registering a total network disconnect. It's not just offline, it's gone. Either the cable's been physically severed, which is damn near impossible, or the system has been compromised by something so advanced it could spoof the security handshake and force a manual shutdown from the inside. Either way," he concluded, turning to face her, "we're dark." The casual way he said, "we're dark," grated on her. It suggested a shared fate, an equality she refused to acknowledge. "That's unacceptable," she said, her voice dropping to a glacial chill. "I paid for the best. I paid for foolproof." Leo let out a short, humorless laugh, a bark of sound that seemed to mock the sterile perfection of the room. He leaned back against the console, and for the first time, he seemed to be looking at her not as a client to be placated, but as a problem to be managed. A particularly clueless one. "Ma'am," he said, his voice laced with the weary patience of someone explaining a simple, unchangeable concept to a child. "Nothing is foolproof. The people who build these systems, the people who sell them to you for millions of dollars, they just hope they're smarter than the people trying to break them. Today, it looks like they weren't." His words and the casual, almost didactic authority with which he spoke them were a slap in the face. She was Isabella Sterling. She did not get lectured by maintenance boys in greasy overalls. Her world was one of action, of bending reality to her will. "Check the internal schematics," she ordered, her voice reverting to the clipped, commanding tone of the boardroom. "There must be a service panel with a physical release mechanism for the door's hydraulics." Leo shook his head slowly, a small, pitying smile playing on his lips that infuriated her. "You really don't get it, do you? The whole point of this room, the reason it costs so much, is that there is no simple physical release. That would be a vulnerability. Every system is cross-linked and software-controlled. If I try to force the hydraulics, the central power grid will register it as tampering and automatically shut down. We'd be left in total darkness with no air circulation. We'd be dead in 3 hours instead of 12. His logic was cold, sharp, and undeniable. In this room, her millions were just paper. Her commands were just noise. Knowledge was the only currency that mattered, and he was the only one with of any. The power dynamic hadn't just shifted, it had been turned completely upside down, a violent, nauseating vertigo. It was a terrifying, disorienting sensation, like watching her own company's stock market value evaporate in real time. She stalked to the other side of the room, needing to put distance between them, needing a moment to process this new, intolerable reality. She ran a hand over a smooth, seamless titanium wall, searching for a flaw, a weakness, and finding none. This $1,000,000 fortress, she muttered, the frustration boiling over into a rare display of outward anger, can't even open a single door. It's ridiculous. From across the room, Leo's dry voice cut through her fury without missing a beat. You paid for it to keep people out, not to let you out easily. As far as I can tell, it's working perfectly. She shot him a glare so venomous it could have etched glass, but his back was already turned to her as he methodically began to examine a secondary power conduit. The slight slump of his shoulders was the only sign that he might not be as calm as he pretended. The humor, if it could be called that, was a bitter pill. He was right. The fortress had worked. It had sealed her in safe from the world, with only her own suffocating powerlessness for company. Hours began to crawl by with agonizing slowness. Isabella, a woman whose life was scheduled down to the minute, found the endless, unstructured, and uncontrolled time to be a unique form of torture. She paced the length of the room, the soft, expensive clicks of her heels a frantic counterpoint to the steady, indifferent hum of the machines. 10 paces one way, a sharp, angry turn 10 paces back. It was a cage no matter how expensive the materials. She was a lioness accustomed to ruling her domain, now confined to a space that refused to bend to her will. Leo, in contrast, seemed to sink into the situation, to find a strange sort of purpose in it. He methodically checked every system, every panel, not with the frantic energy of someone trying to escape, but with the focused, quiet curiosity of a master mechanic trying to understand a new and fascinating engine. He worked in silence occasionally, letting out a low grunt of frustration or a soft whistle of discovery. He was a puzzle solver. And this was the ultimate puzzle box. Isabella finally stopped pacing, the futility of the action weighing on her. She sat on the edge of the medical bay cot, the first sign of concession she'd allowed herself. She watched him, this boy, this stranger, who now held more sway over her immediate future than her entire board of directors combined. He seemed so self-contained, unimpressed by her, by the room, by the staggering wealth it represented. He treated her less like a billionaire and more like a faulty, unpredictable component in a system he was trying to fix. She felt a flicker of a long, dormant emotion, something that wasn't anger or frustration. It was curiosity. "Who are you?" she asked, the words leaving her mouth before her conscious mind could stop them. It was a question she never asked. She read dossiers, not people. Leo paused his work, a wrench held loosely in his hand. He glanced over his shoulder, his blue eyes unreadable. "I'm the guy you hired to make sure your doomsday bunker works," he said, his voice flat. "Looks like I did my job too well." He turned back to his work, the conversation for him clearly over. But for Isabella, it was just beginning. She was trapped, powerless, and for the first time in a very long time, she was not in control of the narrative. the silence that followed his words was different. It wasn't just the absence of noise. It was the heavy-weighted silence of two worlds colliding in a space far too small to contain them both. The 6th hour bled into the 7th with no change. The digital chronometer on the wall, a placid green display of unwavering precision, had become a source of profound torment for Isabella. Each passing minute was a drop of water in a slow, relentless torture, a silent, ticking reminder of her complete and utter impotence. The air, though scientifically breathable, now carried a distinct metallic tang, a manufactured taste that coated her tongue and the back of her throat. The fortress was starting to feel less like a sanctuary and more like a tomb. She had abandoned her pacing hours ago. The nervous, aggressive energy had burned itself out, leaving behind a cold, heavy fatigue that settled deep in her bones. She now sat on the diagnostic cot, her posture, for the first time, in what felt like decades less than perfect. Her shoulders, usually held in a ramrod straight line of authority, were slumped slightly. She had removed the jacket of her suit, folding it with meticulous, almost obsessive precision, and placing it beside her, a small, futile act of imposing order on a situation spiraling into chaos. She was left in her silk shell top, which felt flimsy and wholly inadequate against the oppressive, unyielding chill of the room. The carefully constructed mask of the infallible CEO, a mask she had worn for so long it had practically fused to her skin, was beginning to crack. A tremor had started in her hands, a slight but persistent shaking she couldn't control. She hid them in her lap, pressing them together, hoping Leo wouldn't notice, but she knew it was a foolish hope. In the small, bright, shadowless room, every detail was magnified. He noticed everything. He was currently sitting cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by a constellation of glowing blue schematics he had projected onto the smooth titanium surface. He had managed to reroute power from a non-essential life support monitor to create a low-level holographic projector. It was a small act of technical genius that left Isabella feeling both impressed and strangely deeply resentful. He was adapting, problem-solving, creating. She was just waiting, fading. Any progress, she asked, her voice thinner than she would have liked, the sound swallowed by the humming stillness. Maybe, he said, without looking up from the glowing lines of code. There's a tertiary maintenance port behind this wall panel. It's not on the main schematic, probably for security reasons buried in the subroutines. If I can access it, I might be able to manually trigger a full system reset. It's a long shot. What are the risks? She asked the question, automatic, a ghost of her former self. Best case, it works, and the doors open. Worst case, he paused, tapping a finger on the projection, his voice casual. I could cause a power surge that fries the life support systems permanently. So you know. High stakes. She fell silent, a knot of ice forming in her stomach. The casual way he spoke of life and death was unnerving. For him it was a technical problem, a matter of risk and reward. For her it was the terrifying, visceral reality of her own mortality. She who had mastered the art of the hostile takeover, who could make or break fortunes with a single phone call, was now entirely dependent on a boy who probably made less in a year than she spent on a case of wine. The tremor in her hands worsened a frantic, uncontrollable flutter. A cold sweat beaded on her forehead and trickled down her temples. She recognized the symptoms with a sickening lurch of her stomach. Her diabetes. In her meticulously scheduled life, her meals and insulin doses were a fixed, unchangeable constant managed with the same precision as her investment portfolio. But here, trapped for hours without food, her body's delicate chemical balance was tipping into chaos. She had an emergency insulin pen in her purse, a sleek, expensive device. But a stubborn, foolish pride, the same pride that had built this fortress, kept her from admitting her weakness. Admitting it would be ceding the last crumbling bastion of her authority. It felt like a surrender she was not yet willing to make. "I need you to open that panel," she said. Her voice strained each word, an effort. Leo finally looked up, his gaze lingering on her face. He seemed to truly register the change in her condition for the first time. The cynical shield in his eyes lowered for a fraction of a second, replaced by a look of sharp, clinical assessment. "You don't look so good," he observed, his tone neutral. "You're pale." "I'm fine," she snapped too quickly, the denial sharp and brittle. "Just do your job." He held her gaze for a long moment, an unreadable expression on his face, before shrugging and turning back to the wall panel. He began to work at the sealed edges with a specialized laser-etched tool from his kit. The soft, rhythmic scraping sound seemed to echo the frantic scratching of panic in Isabella's own mind. The room felt like it was shrinking, the white walls pressing inward. She felt dizzy, a wave of nausea washing over her. She gripped the edge of the cot, her knuckles turning white. She tried to focus on her breathing, on the mindfulness techniques her high-priced wellness coach had taught her for managing stress. Inhale, control. Exhale, chaos. But there was no controlling this. The chaos was inside her, in her own rebelling cells, a hostile takeover of her own body. She watched Leo work, his movements precise and economical. He was completely absorbed, a world away from her internal turmoil. He was a survivor. She saw it in the way he conserved his energy, in the focused, almost detached way he approached the problem. He was used to difficult situations, to making do with what he had. She, on the other hand, was used to bending the world to her will. And the world was no longer bending. Her vision began to blur at the edges, the clinical white light fracturing into a painful halo. The humming of the air scrubbers grew louder, a roaring in her ears that drowned out all other sound. She saw the ghost of her son's face, not as he was now, but as he was in her memories, a boy with bright, hopeful eyes before they had clouded with disappointment. "A fortress, Mom. You locked yourself in." His voice was a whisper in the roaring chaos of her mind. He was right. She had built the perfect prison, and now it was claiming her. She tried to call out to Leo, tried to form the words to tell him about the insulin pen in her purse, but her tongue felt thick and heavy, a useless weight in her mouth. The words wouldn't form. A black tide was rising behind her eyes, a final silent wave threatening to pull her under. With a final desperate gasp for air that produced no sound, Isabella Sterling's world went dark. She slumped sideways onto the cot, her body limp, her carefully constructed world collapsing into nothingness. The locket she always wore, a small gold heart on a delicate chain, swung free from the collar of her silk blouse. As her body went still, it hit the edge of the cot with a soft metallic tink. The clasp, weakened by years of constant nervous fiddling, sprang open. In the cold, sterile, and unforgiving light of the heart, the faded photograph inside lay exposed, the smiling face of a young boy, her son Daniel, from a time long before the fortress had ever been built. A fortune in his hands, but a soul in the balance. The soft, dull thud of Isabella's body hitting the cot cut through Leo's concentration like a blade. He spun around from the wall panel, his wrench clattering to the floor with a sharp, discordant clang. For a moment that stretched into two, he simply froze. The formidable, unshakable CEO, the woman who radiated an aura of pure, indomitable will, was now just a crumpled figure on a white bed. Her face, a waxy, unnerving shade of grey. Her chest rose and fell in shallow, ragged breaths, that were barely perceptible in the humming quiet. "Hey," he called out, his voice sharp, instinctively professional. "Ma'am Isabella." There was no response. The silence that answered him was heavy and absolute. Panic and emotion he thought he'd mastered and suppressed through a lifetime of small-time crises and thankless jobs pricked at him with cold, sharp needles. This wasn't a faulty circuit or a jammed gear. This was a life fragile and flickering in a room with no exits. He scrambled over to her side, his own cynicism momentarily forgotten, replaced by the urgent problem-solving instincts of a technician. He pressed 2 fingers to her neck, searching for a pulse. It was there, but it was thready and dangerously fast. Her skin was cold and clammy to the touch. He recognized the signs with a jolt of certainty. He'd seen a similar collapse once before, an old man in the run-down apartment building where he used to live. Diabetic shock. His eyes scanned the room, then landed on her designer handbag, a sleek leather thing that had probably cost him 2 months' rent. It lay on the floor where it had fallen. He hesitated for only a second before grabbing it, the expensive leather-feeling alien in his grease-stained hands. He unzipped the main compartment. He wasn't stealing, he was searching. His fingers pushed past a ridiculously oversized wallet, a set of solid gold pens that felt heavy and obscene, and a velvet pouch that clinked with the distinct weight of what could only be jewelry. He ignored them all, his search growing more frantic. Tucked into a side pocket, his fingers brushed against a slim, clinical-looking plastic device. He pulled it out. An auto-injector pen. The label confirmed it insulin. He held the pen in his hand, the cool, smooth plastic, a stark contrast to the warmth of his skin. This was the solution. A simple injection, a matter of seconds, and she would likely stabilize. It was the right thing to do. The human thing to do. But as he looked at her unconscious form, a darker, colder thought slithered into his mind, unwelcome and ugly. He looked from her pale, vulnerable face to the open handbag on the floor, the wallet stuffed with high-denomination bills, the gold pens, the velvet pouch of jewelry. He could take it all. When the doors finally opened, he could be gone before anyone was the wiser. They would assume a low-level technician, and nobody could never afford to just disappear. But with this, he could. This was more money than he had ever seen in his life. Enough to start over. Enough to get away from the grime and the grease and the endless, condescending looks from people exactly like her. The memory of his father's face, years ago, flashed in his mind, as clear and painful as if it were yesterday. The defeated slump of his shoulders, the hollow look in his eyes, as he told the family they'd lost the farm. A faceless corporation, not unlike Sterling Industries, had bought up the regional bank, restructured the debt, and foreclosed with brutal efficiency. They had been erased, their generations of hard work, their entire history reduced to a line item on a quarterly report. And here was the architect of one of those very corporations, helpless at his feet. It wasn't justice. But in the twisted, silent logic of the vault, it felt like a cosmic form of opportunity. Revenge and reward, all in one neat package. His gaze fell again on Isabella's still form, and he noticed the locket for the first time. It lay open on her chest, a small golden heart against the dark silk of her blouse. He leaned closer, his curiosity piqued. Inside was a tiny, slightly faded photograph of a smiling boy, maybe 10 or 11 years old, with bright, happy, uncomplicated eyes. He looked nothing like the hard, polished woman on the cot. He looked loved, cared for. He looked like he had a home. Something inside Leo shifted a tectonic plate of long-buried emotion. That picture wasn't of a CEO. It wasn't of a corporate predator. It was of a mum who, for all her wealth and power and influence, carried a picture of her kid around her neck, just like his own mother did, with a worn-out, creased photo of him and his sister in her own cheap wallet. The thought was a pinprick in the balloon of his anger and resentment, letting the bitterness slowly hiss out. He looked back at the insulin pen in his hand. This was a choice. It wasn't just between saving her and robbing her. It was a choice about who he was going to be. Was he the sum of his grievances, a product of the bitterness that had been his constant companion for years? Or was he something more? Was he the kind of person who would let a mother die for the sake of a long-shot chance at a different, richer life? He thought again of the old man in his apartment building. He had called 911, had stayed with him, had held his hand and talked to him until the paramedics arrived. He hadn't thought about it then. He had just acted. Why was this different? Because she was rich. Because she represented a system that had crushed his family. Was his own humanity conditional? He looked at her face again, no longer seeing a corporate titan, but just a person in trouble. Someone's mother. Someone's daughter. Broken. Vulnerable. Human, with a deep, shuddering sigh that seemed to carry the weight of his entire 22 years. He made his choice. He uncapped the insulin pen. With a practiced, steady hand, a hand used to dealing with delicate, complex machinery, he administered the injection into her upper arm, the small click of the device, loud in the stillness. He sat back on his heels, the now empty pen feeling impossibly heavy in his hand. He hadn't saved a billionaire. He hadn't saved his enemy. He had just saved a person. And in the profound humming silence of the vault, he felt a strange, quiet sense of peace settle over him. He hadn't become rich. He hadn't gotten his revenge. But in that moment, he realized he had saved something far more valuable. He hadn't become the monster he was secretly afraid he might be. He carefully, gently closed the locket, the small click echoing in the room. He tucked it back inside the collar of her blouse, hiding the secret of the smiling boy from the cold, sterile light. He then picked up her handbag, zipped it shut, and placed it back on the floor beside the cot, everything exactly as it had been. He retreated to his corner of the room, picked up his fallen wrench, and waited. The choice was made. Now he would live with it. The truth doesn't set you free. It just breaks the right walls. Isabella's return to consciousness was slow and disorienting, a reluctant climb from a deep black well. It started with a dull, throbbing headache and the lingering chemical taste of insulin in her mouth. Her first coherent thought was one of confusion. The last thing she remembered was the room spinning, the walls closing in like a vice. Now she was lying down, a strange artificial warmth spreading through her limbs, pushing back the debilitating cold that had threatened to consume her. She opened her eyes. The white lights of the heart seemed impossibly bright, sterile, and unforgiving. She blinked, and the room swam into a sharp, painful focus. She saw him. Leo. He was sitting in the corner, just as before, watching her. But his expression was different now. The cynicism was gone, replaced by something she couldn't quite decipher. It was a look of quiet, weary observation, as if he had seen something he wished he hadn't. She pushed herself up into a sitting position, her muscles aching in protest. Her hand instinctively went to her neck. The locket was there, securely fastened. Had she imagined it opening? Then her gaze fell to her arm, to the small, angry red pinprick on her skin, just below the sleeve of her silk top. Her eyes shot to her handbag, sitting neatly on the floor beside the cot, zipped shut. Too neatly. Her mind, sharp and analytical, even in its groggy state, assembled the pieces with brutal speed. The collapse. The insulin pen from her back. Him. You went through my bag, she said, her voice a harsh rasp. It wasn't a question. It was an accusation. The terrifying vulnerability she had felt moments before was instantly encased in a familiar protective shield of anger. Control once lost had to be reclaimed swiftly and without mercy. Leo didn't flinch under her glare. He simply nodded, his gaze steady. You were in diabetic shock, he stated, his voice flat and devoid of apology. You were dying. You had no right. She shot back the words like ice. I suppose I could have let you, he replied, his logic simple and unassailable. Would that have been better? His direct logical response disarmed her. She had no answer to that. She had built her life on the principle that weakness was a fatal flaw, something to be hidden, crushed, and denied at all costs. He had not only seen her at her absolute weakest, he had treated it. He had saved her. The thought was galling, an unbearable debt she had never intended to incur. She looked at him, truly looked at him, searching for the angle, the play. There had to be one. People didn't act without self-interest. It was the first rule of her world. Just then, a loud, violent crackle from the overhead speaker made them both jump. A voice, tinny and distorted by the strained connection, filled the room. It was Mike, her chief of security. Ma'am, Mrs. Sterling, can you hear me? We've managed to establish a one-way audio link. We still can't override the doors from out here. The system is completely locked down. We're working on it. Just hold on. In there, his voice dropped heavy, with a significance he couldn't have understood. You can only rely on the person with you. The voice cut out, leaving a heavy, ringing silence in its wake. Mike's words, meant to be reassuring, had the opposite effect. You can only rely on the person with you. The thought was terrifying. For her entire adult life, the only person Isabella had ever truly relied on was herself. She looked at Leo again. He was just a boy, a stranger, a representative of a world she actively avoided. Yet Mike was right. His actions had proven it. He could have robbed her blind. He could have stood by and watched her die. He had done neither. And the question, the one her entire worldview couldn't answer, was why. The question hung in the air between them, unspoken but immense. The fortress designed to protect her from every conceivable physical threat had perversely created a space of absolute emotional vulnerability. There were no assistants to interrupt, no meetings to run, to no layers of corporate hierarchy to hide behind. There was just the two of them, the suffocating truth and the remaining hours on the clock. She broke the silence, her voice barely a whisper, the fight draining out of her. The locket, she said, her hand rising to touch the small golden heart at her throat. You saw it. Leo nodded again, his gaze dropping to the floor as if in deference to a private grief. A picture of a kid. His name is Daniel. She said the name, feeling foreign and fragile on her tongue after years of disuse. She didn't know why she was telling him this. Perhaps it was a debt to be paid for her life. Perhaps after years of holding it all in, the fortress walls inside her were finally, irrevocably starting to crack. She looked away from him, her eyes fixed on the blank titanium wall opposite her, but she wasn't seeing it. She was seeing her son's face years ago. His eyes filled with a hurt so deep it had shattered them both. The last time I saw him, she began, her voice low and thick with the unshed tears of 2 years. He told me I didn't build a home. He said I built a fortress. She let out a dry, broken laugh that held no humor, only pain. Ironic, isn't it? Here I am, trapped in the real thing. She finally turned to look at Leo, her eyes shining with a raw, painful light that stripped away the last vestiges of the powerful CEO. He said, I built it to keep the world out, but all I did was lock him out and lock myself in. And he was right. She whispered the confession, a physical weight leaving her. God, he was so right. The confession hung in the air, stripped of all artifice. It was the deepest, most painful truth of her life, spoken aloud for the first time, not to a therapist or a trusted friend, but to a boy who was the living embodiment of the messy, unpredictable world she had tried so hard to keep at bay. Leo was silent for a long time. He didn't offer empty platitudes or awkward reassurances. He just listened, affording her a quiet dignity she hadn't realized she craved. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, devoid of its earlier sarcasm, filled instead with a weary resignation. "My family," he said, his eyes distant, seeing a different time and place. "We had a farm. My dad, my grandfather. They worked that land their whole lives. Then a big conglomerate, a company like yours, bought the regional bank that held our loan. They restructured the debt. Called it maximizing assets. We called it ruin." He paused, swallowing hard against a memory. "We lost everything. Just erased. Because to them we weren't a family with a history. We were just a number on a spreadsheet." He looked up then, and his clear blue eyes met hers. For the first time there was no anger in them, no resentment. There was just a shared, profound and devastating understanding of loss. "I guess," he said softly, his voice barely disturbing the air, "everyone has a fortress of some kind. And everyone has something or someone they've lost to it. In the cold, sterile heart of a billionaire's bunker, two broken souls from two different worlds had finally found a common language. It wasn't the language of money or power. It was the universal language of pain, and in that shared moment, the walls between them, more formidable than any slab of titanium, finally began to crumble. They had to learn each other's language to read the map out. The confessions, raw and unvarnished, left a different kind of silence in their wake. It wasn't the tense, hostile quiet from the first few hours, nor the dead, fearful silence from when the power had failed. This was a fragile, contemplative stillness, the kind that follows a storm when the air is clean and the world feels strangely new. The invisible line that had separated the billionaire from the technician, a line drawn with money power and prejudice, had been smudged, if not erased entirely, by the shared language of pain. Isabella looked at Leo, no longer seeing a cynical boy in a greasy uniform, but a young man who had carried a burden of loss as heavy and as formative as her own. His pain didn't diminish hers, but it made it less lonely. It made it human. For the first time, she felt a flicker of something beyond gratitude or a sense of uncomfortable debt. She felt a sliver of genuine connection, a strange and unfamiliar warmth in the cold, sterile room. It was Leo who broke the stillness. He stood up, his movements no longer languid or cynical, but infused with a new, quiet purpose. "Okay," he said, his voice practical, pulling them both back from the precipice of their shared sorrow. "Feeling sorry for ourselves isn't going to get this door open. Let's get back to work." This time when he said, "let's," a word that had grated on her just hours before, Isabella didn't bristle. She simply nodded, a silent accord passing between them. The gesture was small, but it was a seismic shift. It was an agreement, an acceptance. She slid off the cot, her body still weak, but her mind sharp, re-energized by a new, unfamiliar sense of purpose. It was no longer just about her escape. It was about their escape. "That tertiary maintenance port you mentioned," she said, her tone shifting from that of a wounded mother back to that of a CEO, but with a crucial difference. It was no longer a command. It was a collaboration. behind this panel? What's the protocol for accessing it? Leo was already moving towards the wall, picking up his tools. There is no protocol, he said, his focus sharp. It's a deep system fail-safe meant to be accessed only by the system architect with a specific quantum key. It's probably booby-trapped electronically. If I try to access it directly, it'll send a feedback loop that will fry every chip in a 10-foot radius, including the ones in this projector and my diagnostic tools, so we can't access it electronically. Isabella surmised, her mind racing, falling into the familiar, comfortable rhythm of problem-solving. What about physically? The panel is seamless. No visible locks or bolts. It's held in place by a series of high-powered electromagnets, which are currently active and drawing power from the secondary grid. Electromagnets run on power. She stated a plan beginning to form in her mind, a spark of her old, formidable self returning. If we could create a localized electromagnetic pulse, a small one, it could disrupt the magnetic field just long enough for you to pry the panel open. Leo stopped his work and looked at her, a newfound, genuine respect dawning in his eyes. An EMP. How do we create an EMP in a room specifically designed to be shielded from them? We don't need to be perfect, she countered, her mind already several steps ahead, pointing a decisive finger toward the medical bay. That diagnostic cot. It has a defibrillator. If you can bypass the safety regulators on the power supply and reroute the capacitor's charge into a focused, unshielded coil. Leo's eyes lit up with a flash of pure intellectual understanding. He finished her thought. I could create a directed short-range pulse. It's risky as hell. The feedback could blow the whole medical bay console, a risk I'm willing to take. Isabella said, her voice firm, unwavering, and just like that, they became a team. The next few hours were a blur of focused, collaborative energy that was almost startling in its efficiency. They were a study in contrasts, a perfect fusion of two different kinds of intelligence. Isabella, with her sharp, strategic mind, saw the whole system, the logic, the potential points of failure. She became the mission director, calling out power ratings, calculating risks, and processing information with the speed of a supercomputer. Leo was the tactical expert, the hands-on engineer. He dismantled parts of a server rack to get at the heavy-gauge wiring he needed, stripped cables with his teeth when his tools weren't precise enough, and repurposed components with an ingenuity born from a lifetime of making things work with next to nothing. At one point, exhausted and running on fumes, they broke for a meal. Leo pulled two foil-wrapped brick-like objects from the emergency supply kit. He tossed one to Isabella. She caught it, turning it over in her hands, with a look of profound distaste, as if it were a distasteful quarterly report. What is this? Emergency ration bar, Leo said, already tearing his open with an practiced rip. 3,000 calories. Tastes like chalk and despair, but it'll keep you alive. Isabella cautiously opened the wrapper and sniffed it. Her nose wrinkled in a way that was almost comical. This, she declared with the unwavering gravity of a seasoned food critic, is worse than the food in economy class. Leo, who had just taken a large, unapologetic bite of his paused mid-chew. A slow, genuine grin spread across his face, the first one she had seen from him that wasn't tinged with irony. To me, he said, after swallowing, it's like a 5-star restaurant dinner. At least it's free. Isabella found herself smiling back, a real, tired but honest smile. The wall was gone. The shared joke, as bland and unappetizing as the ration bar itself, was a small, sturdy bridge built between their two vastly different worlds. They got back to work, their movements now, more synchronized, their communication, economical and efficient. The easy shorthand of a team that has found its rhythm. Hand me the number 3, Phillips. Watch that lead, it's live. Okay, on 3. 1, 2. They were no longer a billionaire and a boy. They were a mind and a pair of hands working as one. Isabella found a strange, unfamiliar exhilaration in the process. For years, her work had been abstract deals, mergers, stock prices. It was a world of numbers on screens and conversations in sterile boardrooms. This was real. The sharp smell of ozone from a stripped wire, the solid feel of tools in her hands, the immediate, tangible consequence of every single decision. It was terrifying, and it was the most alive she had felt in years. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of trial and error, their makeshift EMP device was ready. It was an ugly Frankensteinian contraption, a coil of heavy copper wire wrapped around a defibrillator paddle, jury-rigged to a power conduit, with electrical tape and sheer willpower. "This is it," Leo said, his face grim with concentration, sweat beading on his brow. "If this doesn't work, we're out of options, and possibly out of lights." Isabella took a deep breath, her eyes meeting his across the small space. The air was thick with anticipation. "I trust you." She said the words, simple, direct, and more true than anything she had said in a very long time. The words surprised them both with their weight, but as she said them, she realized they were true. In the heart of her fortress, surrounded by the best security money could buy, the only thing she truly trusted was the cynical boy with the greasy hands and the honest eyes. "Okay," Leo said, his voice steady, strengthened by her unexpected faith. "Stand back." He took a deep breath of his own, gave her a final, determined nod, and with a hand that did not tremble, he reached out to complete the circuit. Freedom's first breath is the loudest sound. The moment Leo's finger connected the final wire to the makeshift coil, the room seemed to hold its breath. For a fraction of a second, there was an unnatural, absolute silence as the room's power diverted to their desperate, ugly device. Then a loud, sharp crack split the air, a sound like lightning striking just feet away. The defibrillator paddle erupted in a brilliant, blinding flash of blue-white light that seared itself onto Isabella's retinas. A powerful low-frequency hum vibrated through the floor, a deep, resonant www-womp that made her teeth ache and the very air feel thick and heavy. The lights overhead flickered violently once-twice, then died, plunging them into an absolute disorienting darkness, more profound than any she had ever known. Did it work? Isabella's voice was a disembodied sound in the pitch-black tight, with a hope she was terrified to embrace. "Don't know yet." Leo yelled back, his own voice, strained with tension. "The emergency lights should kick back on in a second. They run on a separate capacitor." The seconds stretched into an eternity, each one a lifetime. The darkness was total, a thick, suffocating blanket that erased all sense of space and dimension. Isabella could hear nothing but the sound of her own ragged breathing and the frantic, wild thumping of her heart against her ribs. The steady, reassuring hum of the air scrubbers had stopped. The silence was no longer contemplative. It was dead. For one horrifying, gut-wrenching moment, she was utterly convinced they had failed, that their final desperate gamble had resulted in a permanent power failure, leaving them entombed in a silent, lightless grave. Then, with a low, welcome buzz, the emergency light strips along the base of the walls flickered to life. The cold, sterile, white light felt like a glorious sunrise. Isabella's eyes still adjusting shot to the wall panel. Leo was already there, a heavy steel crowbar he'd taken from the emergency kit, wedged into a barely perceptible seam at the edge of the panel. The EMP had worked. The high-powered electromagnets were offline. "I've got a purchase," he grunted, putting his entire wiry weight into the crowbar. "It's heavy. The vacuum seal is tight." Isabella, without a word, rushed to his side. Together she said, her voice a determined rasp. She found her own grip on the cold, unforgiving steel of the bar, her hands accustomed to signing billion-dollar contracts, now raw and ready for brute force. They pulled their synchronized grunts and strained breaths, echoing in the now eerily quiet room. The panel resisted metal, groaning in protest against metal. Sweat streamed down Isabella's face, plastering stray hairs to her temples. Her muscles, unused to such raw physical exertion, screamed in protest. This was a primal physical effort, a world away from the intellectual combat of her daily life. She felt a fierce, raw determination. She hadn't known she possessed a strength that had nothing to do with her name or her bank account. With a final synchronized heave that felt like it tore the muscles in her back, the panel gave way. It peeled back with a deafening, high-pitched screech of tortured metal to reveal a dark, yawning cavity in the wall, filled with a dense, intimidating nest of color-coded conduits and glowing junction boxes. "I'm in." Leo breathed a wide, triumphant grin, splitting his grimy face. He shone his small pocket flashlight into the opening, the beam cutting through the darkness. "Okay," he said, the grin vanishing as his focus returned. Now the hard part. For the next hour he worked in the cramped space, his body half disappeared into the wall, with Isabella holding the flashlight beam steady for him and handing him tools as he called for them. He was a surgeon, navigating the complex, vital anatomy of the fortress's central nervous system. He explained what he was doing in a low, focused murmur, more to himself than to her, a litany of technical jargon that she didn't understand but found strangely reassuring. "The primary lockdown command is routed through this optical processor. If I can create a bypass loop, send a false all-clear signal directly to the door's hydraulic control unit, I have to isolate the actuator from the main security matrix." She watched, mesmerized by his quiet competence. She was witnessing a master at his craft. In her world, brilliance was measured in stock portfolios and market capitalization in ruthless negotiations and flawless presentations. Here in the heart of her fortress, brilliance was measured in the sure, steady movements of a young man's hands as he patiently and methodically rewired the very definition of their reality. He was an artist, and his canvas was the intricate, dangerous machinery of control. Finally, he slid out from the opening, covered in dust and a fine sheen of sweat. "That's it," he said, wiping his hands on his already filthy overalls. "I've bypassed the main lockdown sensor. I've sent a direct, unauthorized command to the hydraulic release valve. If the system accepts it, and if I didn't accidentally trip some other, deeper fail-safe I couldn't see, that door should open." When Isabella asked, her heart pounding a heavy, frantic rhythm against her ribs. "The command is on a 30-second delay," he said, his eyes meeting hers, a mixture of hope and terror in their depths. "To give us time to get clear in case I, messed up, and it blows the hydraulic charge." They scrambled to the far side of the room, without another word, their backs pressed against the cool titanium wall, their eyes fixed on the monolithic slab of the main door. They were a team who had fought their way through a shared ordeal, their fates now intertwined, hanging in the balance of these final agonizing seconds. They counted down together in their heads, a silent, shared prayer. 10. Isabella found herself holding her breath, a tightness in her chest. 9. She could feel the tremor of anticipation running through Leo, who stood shoulder to shoulder beside her. 8. The room was utterly, completely silent, waiting. 7. She thought of Daniel. She didn't know if she would ever see him again, but for the first time, she felt like she had something worthwhile, something true to tell him if she did. 6, 5, 4. A loud, decisive clang echoed through the room, a metallic shockwave that made them both flinch. It was the sound of the primary magnetic locks disengaging. It was working. 3. A low, deep groan began to emanate from the door, the sound of a sleeping giant stirring from its long slumber. 2. With an ear-splitting, triumphant hiss of hydraulics, the 4-ton titanium slab began to move. 1. Slowly, agonizingly, a vertical sliver of light appeared at the edge of the door. It widened, spilling blessed, ordinary, chaotic light from the outside world into their sterile, white prison. The light illuminated the dust motes, dancing in the air, a sight more beautiful to Isabella than any diamond, more precious than any work of art. The door slid fully open, revealing a crowd of stunned security guards in tactical gear and frantic, pale-faced executives on the other side. The first face Isabella saw was Mike's, her security chief, his expression a mask of profound relief and utter slack-jawed disbelief. They had done it. Isabella and Leo stood side by side, blinking in the sudden, overwhelming brightness, 2 survivors emerging from the depths. They were exhausted, filthy, and emotionally shattered. But as they took their first tentative steps out of the heart and into the noise and light of the world they had left behind, they were for the first time, in what felt like a lifetime, truly free. The escape was over. The rescue was about to begin. The moment they crossed the threshold of the heart, their unlikely, fragile partnership dissolved, and the world rushed in to reassert its old, familiar order. Security guards in heavy tactical gear swarmed around Isabella, their voices a babble of professional concern and profound relief. "Ma'am, are you all right? We need to get you to the medics immediately. We have the perimeter secured, ma'am." She was once again Isabella Sterling, the CEO, the untouchable matriarch of Sterling Industries, a precious asset to be secured. A cocoon of expensive suits and armed security formed around her, insulating her from the chaos she had just escaped. Leo, meanwhile, was instantly and seamlessly relegated to the background. He became invisible again, just the maintenance kid in a dirty uniform, a piece of the scenery, a problem that had now been resolved. A few of the guards gave him cursory, suspicious glances before turning their full, undivided attention back to the true center of power. Isabella was whisked away, a phalanx of her executives shielding her as she was guided towards the private elevators. As the doors began to close, she looked back over her shoulder, her eyes scanning the crowd for him. She saw Leo, standing alone near the ravaged wall panel, looking small and utterly out of place amidst the corporate chaos, a forgotten wrench still clutched in his hand. Their eyes met for a brief final second across the crowded room. It was a look of silent, shared understanding, a final acknowledgement of the strange, intense world they had inhabited, together a world that no longer existed. Then the polished elevator doors slid shut, and he was gone. The days that followed were a whirlwind of high-level debriefings, exhaustive security reviews, and tense board meetings. The official story, crafted with masterful efficiency by Isabella's public relations team, was of a sophisticated, targeted cyber attack from a rival corporation. The unfortunate but necessary 12-hour lockdown was hailed in a press release as a resounding success of the Sterling Industries security system, proof of its robust and unbreachable design. Leo was briefly questioned by a team of stone-faced corporate lawyers. He signed a thick, non-disclosure agreement that came with a stark warning about the legal consequences of ever speaking about what happened. He was given a small, almost insulting bonus by his contracting company for his professionalism during a crisis. He was a footnote in the official report, a loose end to be tied up and forgotten. But for Isabella, he was the entire story. The experience in the heart had fundamentally rewired her, changing the very chemistry of her soul. The echoing silence of her penthouse felt different now. It was no longer the quiet of peaceful solitude she had once cherished. It was the hollow, aching echo of profound loneliness. The fortress of her life, once a symbol of her strength, now seemed nothing more than a cage of her own, making its walls built of money and regret. She found herself thinking not of stock prices or quarterly earnings, but of the look in Leo's eyes when he spoke of his family's farm, of the quiet integrity in his hands as he chose to save her life over enriching his own, of the tired, honest smile they had shared over a chalky, tasteless ration bar. He had been given every reason to hate her, to harm her, and in the defining moment of their shared crisis, he had chosen kindness. It was a lesson more profound, more valuable than any she had learned in business school or a lifetime of ruthless negotiations. A week after the incident, sitting alone in her vast office overlooking the city, she bypassed her entire executive staff, her gatekeepers and her assistants. She picked up her private phone and made a call herself. Leo received the letter 2 days later at his cramped, one-bedroom apartment on the South Side. It wasn't a check as he might have cynically expected. It was a thick, cream-colored envelope bearing the crest of Northwestern University, an institution that might as well have been on another planet. Confused, his hands trembling slightly, he tore it open. Inside was an official letter of acceptance to the prestigious McCormick School of Engineering. Tucked behind it was another letter, this one, on the heavy personal letterhead of Isabella Sterling. It read, "Leo, talent is a raw material. Opportunity is the factory that refines it. You have the talent. Consider this, the factory. This is not a gift. It is an investment. The world needs more people who know how to build things, and even more who know how to fix what's broken. All expenses are covered by a new endowment. Don't waste it. I.S." At the bottom of the letter, in small, crisp type, was an addendum, the Daniel Sterling Endowment for Applied Engineering and Ethical Innovation. Leo sat on the edge of his lumpy second-hand sofa, the letters trembling in his hands. It wasn't charity. It wasn't a payoff. It was a chance. It was empowerment. It was a future he had never allowed himself to dream of. It was a bridge out of his own world of cynicism and resentment, a bridge built by the most unlikely person imaginable. The final scene of the story did not take place in a gleaming boardroom or a luxurious penthouse. It took place on a quiet, tree-lined street in a modest suburb, miles, and a world away from the gleaming towers of downtown Chicago. Isabella sat in the silent, plush interior of her limousine, the engine off, and simply looked at a small, unassuming 2-story house. There were toys scattered on the lawn, and a basketball hoop, its net frayed, hanging over the garage. It was ordinary. It was messy. It was a home. She had spent days tracking down Daniel's address, using the vast resources at her disposal, not for a corporate takeover, but for a mission of personal, terrifying reconnaissance. She had his phone number. She had his email. But she knew a call or a message would be too easy to ignore, too easy to delete. It would be another command from the CEO, another intrusion from the world he had so desperately fled. She opened her purse, her hand bypassing the expensive pens and the designer wallet. She pulled out a simple plain card and a pen. For a long time she just sat there, the pen hovering over the paper. What could she possibly say? How could she summarize 2 decades of failure and a week of revelation into a few simple sentences? In the end, she wrote only a few words that were both an apology and a beginning. She sealed the envelope, her hands steady now. She didn't send her driver. She didn't send an assistant. She opened the heavy car door and got out herself. The sharp clicks of her heels on the quiet suburban sidewalk sounded unnaturally loud, an intrusion. She walked up the small concrete path, a journey more daunting than any hostile negotiation she had ever faced in her life. She didn't knock. She didn't ring the bell. She simply slid the small plain envelope into the mailbox by the front door, her fingers brushing against the cold metal. Then she turned and walked away, not looking back. She didn't know if he would read it. She didn't know if he would respond. She didn't know if the vast, silent chasm between them could ever be bridged. But as she got back into her car, and the driver pulled away from the curb, leaving the quiet little house behind, Isabella Sterling knew with a certainty that settled deep in her soul that she had finally truly taken her first step out of the fortress. The door was open. The rest was up to him. Sometimes the strongest walls we build are not made of steel or concrete, but of fear and regret, and it often takes being trapped inside them to finally find the courage to search for the door. Isabella and Leo, two souls from opposite ends of the universe, found themselves in such a fortress, only to discover that the only real way out was through each other. Their story reminds us that true strength is not found in the walls we build to protect ourselves, but in the bridges we are brave enough to build to connect with others. Have you ever had a moment, a single encounter with a stranger, that unexpectedly changed the way you saw your own life? We would be so grateful if you would share your thoughts in the comments below. Liking this video and subscribing to our channel helps us continue to share tales that remind us that in the quietest moments, the most profound truths can be found. Thank you for spending your time with us. Until next time, take care.